One of the greatest saints in the church's history, when you looked at his younger years, the last thing you would have ever considered that he was going to be on the path of holiness, that he would choose to live a life truly centered in Christ. He lived a life, as Jesus would put it, a life of dissipation. And he lived a life where he considered the church and Christians, well, to be foolish. He could not understand why anyone would follow the church's teachings. It made no sense to him at all. And of course, all of this broke his mother's heart, and she prayed for him daily. And then something happened. His heart was enlightened. He felt the pull of grace, and it changed his life. Of course, I'm talking about St. Augustine. And the amazing thing about St. Augustine is he was someone who was truly strong in his faith, so strong that he actually wrote a book about his life, which I highly recommend, the Confessions. And he talks about his struggles, about his early life, and about what it took for God to actually get him to open his heart. And one of the most famous passages is one of the most beautiful in Christian history. Late have I loved you, O beauty ever ancient, ever new. Late have I loved you. You were within me. But I was outside, and it was there that I searched for you. In my unloveliness, I plunged into the lovely things which you created. You were with me, but I was not with you. Created things kept me from you, yet if they had not been in you, they would not have been at all. You called, you shouted, and you broke through my deafness. You flashed, you shone, and you dispelled my blindness. You breathed your fragrance on me. I drew in breath, and now I pant for you. I have tasted you. Now I hunger and I thirst for more. You touched me, and I burned for your peace. As we hear these beautiful words of Augustine and his turmoil in seeking the Lord and what God did for him, it should call into question, honestly, the way, if we're honest with ourselves, how many of us kind of look at God. He's sort of the great accountant in the sky. He has his ledger book open, and he's writing down the pluses and minuses of our life, of the things we do right and wrong, and our great hope is that the balance at least comes out to zero. Because our God is ready to figure out how to send us to hell. But that's not our God, and that is ultimately what Augustine discovered. He discovered that our God is a God of relationship, and that is his deepest desire, to truly be in relationship with us. But that can be difficult for many people because, unfortunately, we live in a day and age of cancel culture, which really isn't all that new if we're going to be honest with ourselves, but it is this feeling that once we know who someone is, that's who they are. And once we look at the things that they have done, that is telling of who they are and who they will always be. But Augustine shows us the lie that is. People can change, and they change in the only way possible, not by their own self-determination, but through grace. The grace of God can change any heart, and more importantly, change any attitude. Because that's really what is at the heart of what happened to Augustine. Through the grace of God, his attitude changed. And what is that attitude that we're called to have? St. Paul tells us today, have among yourselves the same attitude that is also in Christ Jesus. So what ultimately is this attitude of Jesus? Well, fortunately, Paul actually tells us. He lays it all out in what is called the great kenotic hymn. Kenosis means self-emptying. In the great hymn that Paul puts before us this day, he opens to us what is that attitude of Christ. And it begins with sacrifice. True sacrifice. And sacrifice is not about making yourself as miserable as possible. I always tell people, if you're doing something that makes you miserable, stop. Because that's not of God. True sacrifice is something actually more difficult in many ways. Sacrifice begins with what we see in Jesus: humility. It is that willingness to truly humble our hearts. And what is humility? It is recognizing that God is God and we are not. As St. Paul reminds us, it is about seeing others as better than ourselves. Why is that? Because, well, when we see people as equal, eventually we see ourselves as better. When we see them as better than us, we might get to equal. But it is that attitude of also opening up, as St. Augustine showed us, to recognize our God in creation, and that it is his gift to us, and it is not for ours to take as we want, which will then open ourselves to our true self. And that humility leads to obedience. Paul reminds us that Jesus was obedient even to death on a cross. This was not something Jesus wanted. We know that in the garden he is very clear, take this cup from me. But in obedience, not my will, but your will. And ultimately, if we're going to change our attitude to be that of Christ, we have to desire to have an attitude of obedience to the will of God in all things. We don't get to pick and choose. And this is what leads us to what Christ does on the cross, to a life of self-offering. And again, in true sacrifice, we don't get to choose what we're going to sacrifice. The Christ's self-offering was the gift of his self, and that's what all true sacrifice is. It is an offering of self to God. And through offering ourselves to God, offering ourselves truly to others. But this is only possible through kenosis. Though he is in the form of God, Jesus did not deem equality with God something to grasp at. Rather, he emptied himself. And we too must empty ourselves a little differently than Jesus. We have to empty ourselves of all that is not of Christ, of all that does not lead us to God, of all that centers life in ourselves. And that must be done away with. Because that's the only way we can end up dying to ourselves. And that's where sacrifice ultimately leads in order for us to truly embrace what it is that Jesus did on the cross and to live that life of unconditional love. Not just for God, but for every single person. And when we can live this attitude of Christ, this attitude that leads to a life of sacrifice, humility, obedience, self-offering, kenosis, dying to self, and unconditional love, it is there that, and only there, that we truly become a disciple of Christ. Because it is there that we, with Christ, take up the cross. And that is the only way that we can bear the cross of Christ. Ultimately, for this to happen, we need God's grace. We need to be able to have that change of attitude. For if we're honest with ourselves, we fall into the same trap of Augustine. We look for God in all the wrong places. We try to seek to discover him in places where, because of how we're seeking him, he will not be found. And the words of Augustine can so easily become true for all of us. Late have I loved you, O beauty ever ancient, ever new. Late have I loved you. You were within me, but I was outside. And it was there that I searched for you. Those words remind us also that you were with me, but I was not with you. We look for God in all the wrong places because we have the wrong attitude. And we need to open up to the grace that leads us to the cross. We need to open up to the grace that leads us to a life of sacrifice. And the amazing thing, as Augustine would discover himself, is that when we open to that grace and that change of attitude, we discover that our God was always with us. He was always in our heart.